This morning, I want you to meet someone that most of you have probably never heard of or heard much of. Okay, I'm going to take that in a sec. As a Society for Ethical Culture, we are focused on how we live our lives, especially in relationship both to those who are near us and in relationship to the calls of our day to make a better world. So it's appropriate that we talk about a life. It's sort of our sacred scripture. The great singer and actress of the last century, Lena Horne, wrote this in her autobiography. The part of me that responds to causes or to injustices or issues, fighting comments on all kinds of issues, that part of me is the creation of my proud activist grandmother, who never seemed to be afraid of anything. And that grandmother was Cora Calhoun Horne. She was born Cora Calhoun Horne in November 1865 in Atlanta, Georgia. Think about that year. Her parents had been enslaved. She was born the month before the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution became law, ending that system of chattel slavery, people as property. Though, of course, it continued to permit involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime. And then soon after, the 14th Amendment promised equal citizenship and protection under the law. It was adopted when Cora wasn't yet 3 years old. And then the 15th, stating that the right to vote could not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That was passed when she was 4 years old. But of course, we know that particularly in the South, and she was born in Georgia, these rights were soon limited, both by Jim Crow laws and outright terrorism against Black citizens. Cora's father, Moses Calhoun, had been an enslaved butler in the home of one of the Calhouns, related to John C. Calhoun, that great Southern defender of the peculiar institution of enslavement. The white Calhouns were among the wealthiest and most powerful people in Georgia. Moses, who married another formerly enslaved person, Mary Fernando, he started a small grocery as a freedman, and that grew into a restaurant, then a boarding house, and considerable financial success. Moses and Mary became part of Atlanta's rising Black middle class. Cora and her younger sister, also named Lena, were sent to the best schools possible for Black young ladies. Cora got her teaching degree at Atlanta University, which is now Clark Atlanta. Among their social circle was a young bachelor, W.E.B. Du Bois. Family history is that Cora's sister rejected his proposal. Cora was baptized as a Catholic. The girls grew up, though, in the First Congregational Church of Atlanta, which was, in those years, proudly interracial and a source of resistance locally to Jim Crow. Cora met and married Edwin F. Horne. He didn't yet have that E on the end of his name. That came much later. He had been born in Tennessee, but raised in Indiana with a British father and an indigenous mother who identified herself actually as a mixed race woman because, as one family member later said, being Indian was harder. Edwin was described as having wavy brown hair and often described as handsome. He and Cora were married in Birmingham. They moved to Chattanooga, and soon they had 2 sons, Errol and Teddy. Now, at that time, it's the mid-90s by that point, Cora and Edwin decided that they would leave the increasingly violent and segregated South. They moved to New York City. They first moved to the area in Manhattan in the West 50s, which was then called Black Bohemia, after its rich artistic and literary culture. After their son Frank was born, they moved to 189 Chauncey Street in Brooklyn, an area home to Brooklyn's Black middle class at that time. And their last child was born in Brooklyn in 1905. But already in 1896, Cora was one of the founding members of an organization called the National Association of Colored Women, the NACW. That was an organization where Black women across the country organized under the motto, "Lifting as we climb." The NACW took on lynching, segregation of public transportation, Jim Crow laws in general, women's suffrage, education, especially for the poor and working class children, and care for children and the elderly. Edwin, Cora's husband, was a teacher in New York's public school system, but he left teaching when a white teacher with less experience was promoted over him. He became a part of what was known as the Afro-American Tammany Hall organization and was active in Democratic Party politics. He became a contractor and builder. Both Cora and Edwin were early members of the NAACP. When Cora's youngest son started school, she had more time for causes, both Black causes and women's causes. Now, one of her causes was equal suffrage for women, the right to vote and hold public office. It's important these days to remember when we talk about the passage of women's suffrage in 1920, that not all Black women were able to vote until the 1960s, thanks to such measures as poll taxes. But simply saying Black women couldn't vote until the 1960s also can erase the incredible work of Black women like Cora Calhoun Horne and Brooklyn's Addie Waits Hunton and Ida B. Wells Barnett in Illinois, all of whose work helped pass women's suffrage and helped millions of Black women in the North to exercise their right to vote beginning in 1920. Even while both their Black sisters and brothers were not yet able to vote under Jim Crow. It's very complicated. Cora actively organized as World War I started to support the troops, and especially the Black troops. And she was appointed to the Mayor's Victory Committee for her work. Sadly, she lost her eldest son, Errol, who was serving in the army in France in that war. He died in the 1918 influenza epidemic, which hit the army especially hard. Around that same time, Cora's son Teddy got married, and he and his wife quickly had a daughter that they named Lena. That's the one you know. Teddy was a bit of a gadabout, is the word they used about him. And his wife was an actress who worked mostly in Black theater, traveling considerably. The young couple soon divorced and both left New York, leaving their toddler Lena for Cora to raise most of her life. Cora continued her active involvements in the community. She helped found the Urban League's Big Sisters Club, and by 1922 was director of the Brooklyn Urban League and one of the officers of the Brooklyn NAACP, as well as secretary of the Brooklyn delegation to the National Conference of the NACW. She was active in the Brooklyn YWCA movement from 1913 and the Brooklyn League on Urban Conditions beginning in 1918. She was also a member of the National Republican Women's Auxiliary, starting about 1924. You know, it helps to remember that it wasn't until the 1960s that the majority of Black voters voted Democratic. Cora served for a time as editor-in-chief of the national newsletter, of the New York newsletter of the NACW. And remember, this is also that flourishing time in New York City and Washington, D.C. of the Harlem Renaissance, and they were connected to many of the people connected with that. Now, during some of her time in New York, Cora was an active member of the Ethical Culture Society, first in Manhattan, and then when she moved, she was active in Brooklyn. She sent her granddaughter Lena to what was then called the Ethical Culture School in Brooklyn. At just 2 years old, Lena was made a member of the NAACP and regularly attended meetings from the age of 2 with her grandmother. When Cora traveled as a national delegate to various conferences, young Lena usually stayed with Cora's Black women activist friends. Sometime in the 1920s, the rising Baha'i movement in New York attracted Cora and Edwin, and they joined that religious organization that also stressed racial harmony and inclusion. I should mention Cora's son, Frank Smith Horne, briefly, too, the third of her children. He lived until 1974. He became an optometrist, but also a poet and an activist. He was part of what was called President Roosevelt's Black Cabinet, and he worked for what became the Federal Housing Administration. Even after he left the federal government, he continued to work for open housing and for better race relations. As one of Cora's last acts, she hosted in February of 1932 a dinner at the Brooklyn YWCA for Atlanta University alumni. Among the speakers was W.B. Du Bois, a lifelong friend of Cora's, and Cora died later that year. At her death, Edwin, her widower, wrote in a letter to Du Bois, "Service was her religion. She enjoyed life to the fullest and was not forgetful of life's responsibilities." And to quote Cora's granddaughter, Paul Robeson called her the toughest little woman he'd ever met. Her granddaughter, Lena, just a year later, after Cora's death, began working at Harlem's Cotton Club, first as a dancer and then as a singer. Within a few years, she appeared in her first film. Stormy Weather came 11 years after her grandmother had died. So Cora never saw her show business career, but would likely have been skeptical of it given her daughter-in-law's life. But Cora probably would have been proud of Lena being part of the March on Washington in 1963. In an interview late in her life, Lena Horne was detailing many ways that racism was a barrier in her early career. Finally, the interview asked, after hearing these horror stories, "Given all that, why don't you hate white people?" And her reply was simple. She said, "Because my grandmother took me to ethical culture and the Urban League." I found that quote by her early in my own time after finding ethical culture. Besides sending me on a search for who Lena Horne's grandmother was, it has had me thinking over the years, what was there in ethical culture in that time that drew Cora Calhoun Horne and that served as a treasured protection for her granddaughter, Lena? And what does it really mean to be a warm environment in which to learn and practice ethical living? What kind of community can we create today and tomorrow that is a microcosm of the future we want to create in the rest of the world? What skills and practices do we bring? And what do we need to learn for that kind of community? For me, these words from a current writer and activist, a spiritual great-granddaughter, if you will, of Cora Calhoun Horne, give voice to today's version of Cora's vision. These are from Amy Marie Brown. She talks of building the capacity, skill, and wide hearts to receive new comrades while practicing daily and deeply what it means to sustain our relationships and collective visions, uphold our values, and adapt towards purpose. So we're going to pause for a minute while we change the batteries.
Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Joan. That's some deep work. I think as me and Joan had been discussing the possibilities of this work, one of the things that I was like, well, we can talk about. I was like, I'm going to leave you to do that work. I've been exploring Black intellectual free thought, and its kind of origin a bit, and what did draw people of color to ethical culture? What was so interesting about ethical culture that really began to create this migration to a movement of early free thinking? And notice I use the word free thinking, and Other terms would have probably been used, such as secular, because it would have been considered secular to do something that was outside of the religious or the American religious Black identity. And to do such things, I would like to quote Dr. James Cone of Black Liberation Theology, where he says, while secular were not strictly atheistic, as defined by modern Western philosophy, they nonetheless uncovered the difficulty Black people encountered when they attempted to relate to white Christian categories to their situations of oppression. So Black seculars did not identify as strictly atheistic. So that makes sense a bit when we think about what ethical culture has created. And Felix did a very good job really creating a non-theistic and theistic framework. It was a religion for the non-religious. And so it held this very ambiguous space to see the formation of social justice as a spiritual application to Black life. It was conversations that were happening within the societies in Philadelphia and Brooklyn and New York society that allowed for Black people to find a way to courageously engage politically and socially and intellectually where they would not have gotten it within their own neighborhood. I like to bring in the ancestor Elaine Locke. Some of us have probably heard the name, but I want to just assure you that Elaine Locke was an attendee of the New York Ethical Society just as well. Around the same time, his mother attended Philadelphia Society. And she writes a letter to Elaine saying the following: I went to the Century Club to hear Professor Josiah Royce on the topic of race, questions, and prejudice. I went early, and I was glad I did. It was really crowded, but such an audience. Culture, she writes, culture was written in every line of their faces, an audience you would have enjoyed. What a word to use during the time, but that was a normal, especially in the 1920s, we are seeing Black people wanting to engage in culture because they do not see culture within their own experience of living in a white world, right? Being Black people. And what was considered to be refined was white culture. That's tough for us to sit with today because it's very different when we talk about how we deal with those intersections. But this is often the framework for the early Black intellect, the early Black intelligentsia, the Black bohemians, right? This is what's happening. There is a need to engage in the sphere that most, particularly in this time, white and white presenting folk are able to engage. Adler created this movement thinking about the challenges of European immigrants, right? Why would I not think about, why would a leader not think about the challenges and the sufferings of those he was also connected to as well? And why would we think about it even at this time too, which we don't talk about a lot, and some of my Black counterparts will know this. Black folk have always felt related to Jewish folk. It was a deep connection. And it was a deep connection, not only because of biblical framework, but because of the genealogy as understood. So that connection maintained for a good while until we see American whiteness co-opt, right? What we understand to be later, right, a white America after the war. So what this brings me to is the following when we look at these early free thinkers. We have to consider that the culture that was happening, especially during the Harlem Renaissance, we have Black artists in Brooklyn. Elaine Locke does something very unique. He stays with the movement until and after, very similar to Calhoun's, until the Depression. because something happens with the culture and the society that we were living in. The idea of scarcity. The Great Depression puts us in a framework of scarcity. And Black folk had already been dealing with suffering. And here it is, our ethical culture that we knew testing 1, 2. There we go. All right. So what we do have is we have this framework where Black people are really lose a sense of belonging. The Depression is also traumatic because it's also a representation of what was considered to be promising, right? Regarding the emancipation. What do you do after emancipation and the Reconstruction in the Jim Crow South? And Black folk have migrated to the North, only to experience now a whole economic deficiency that affects America. And then Black people are now having to, right, find a new voice, right? Find a new place, find new belonging. What does that look like? That's a traumatic experience. They're bringing that story with them from their grandparents, from their parents to the North. And then you have a Great Depression, which leaves them and many folk impoverished and homeless. How does ethical culture respond? How does Adler respond? I love the film I created, but I can be honest. Some of that is a lot of it is about question and nuances about how we have showed up for Black community when in suffering. This is the same work that Cora is trying to do. And how do we align our values beyond just race, but really getting down to the human integrity? My understanding, Joan, was that Cora ends up going to the Baha'i tradition, as well as Elaine Locke did, right? And there is something there between the way that ethical culture was creating this framework to be in a spiritual, social, political pragmatism, right? To engage social justice as a formation to heal community. And then puts us in a space where the Depression, our social implications, COVID has informed our social implications. How do we show up in community? We're dealing with it all over again. How do we respond? Who do we lose sight of because we are in moments of congregational survival? We are in moments of communal survival. We are personally affected. It is all. And how do we hold each other together? I know you were saying earlier in the conversation, I'm gonna give the mic over to you to actually express this, that Adler does have a message that he presents, which kind of points out the diversity that was in the New York society. And I mean, we can go back and forth. I'm fine with sharing the mic.
Yeah, I'm thinking that one of the things that Locke's mother may have meant by seeing culture was that the societies at that time were often multicultural. I think of a man I met who talked about his grandmother when she was first an immigrant from the ghetto of Poland, and she spoke no English. And the only place in America that she felt welcomed was the Ethical Society. And so there were people there who had differences. And one of the things from the founding of the movement, and Felix Adler, who we've talked a lot about, one of the interesting things in terms of the timeline, he died in 1933, retired in about 1931, just before Cora died. And so there were organizational struggles after that. But one of the things that Adler had as his vision was that diversity is not just something we do to decorate the room, that diversity of cultures enriches all of us. And it challenges all of us to think more outside of our own little boxes. So that if, Jay comes from a different background than I do, Jay has a different perspective sometimes than I do. I have a different perspective than he does. And sometimes, and what Adler was, what his vision was that actually is how we best become our best human selves, is not to give up our separate identities, but to learn from them. And I think that is the kind of a community that Cora and Elaine found when they joined in the late 19 teens, 1920s, but left by about the time that the movement was going through organizational struggles and trying to figure out how it survived its very charismatic first leader.
And I think I'm glad you pointed out charismaticism. And I think this is why I like to talk about Alain Locke, because he was an aesthetician. He really loved aesthetics. He was very clear about that. In much of his work, he explained aesthetics as values. That aesthetics, the way that we looked at something, I mean, let's just be real. And this is, and I think one of the things that we have to consider is that Elaine's mother was a teacher. His father was a postal worker in Philadelphia. Now, their parents were also previous enslaved. These individuals migrated to the North. And so we have a real concentration on education. And there's something very powerful about education in this case. And why Elaine really pushes this idea of aesthetics, because aesthetics does not ask the question based off of just tell me what it is. It asks the question based off of show me what it looks like. What does it look like for us when our ethic matches our aesthetic? What does the world look like when I am imagined in a space? And so what we see at this time is we see Black people gravitating towards an education that is rooted in modeling. If you did not model what you said, you do, which is what the Christian church and why many Black folk were actually leaving the church. The boys who had questioned it, right? And so also Frederick Douglass, those who were understood the power of education as, yes, tell me, but make sure that it models what it should look like in the world. That's a different call, but that's no different than what we've always been called to do in this movement. Our religious duty is deed before creed or above creed. How do we practice? How do we show up, right? Our need to do this work is not rooted in a framework of simply saying, I'm going to engage you from a space in which I read my way out of bigotry. I need to practice my way out of bigotry. I've got to be in relationship with you. And so this is why Lena Horne can say, well, my grandmother took me to ethical culture. There was demonstration involved, demonstration of hospitality, a demonstration of welcoming, a demonstration that honestly, I think we ourselves today have to realize when we are set to be in this space, when we are called to be ethical culturists, when we are called to be ethical humanists, we are able to engage the most radical hospitality beyond the color line, as the boys would say, beyond the economic line, beyond the education line. And that is the work that I think Elaine and Cora were experiencing. They were fine, and it might be only a few, right? But the few make a difference in approaching free thinking into a free practice, into a movement that can hold a free spirit, right? And so I think that's just something that I want to highlight as we, think about these individuals where we are today, putting ourselves in contemporary conversation about how we face the challenges of COVID and the decline of communities such as our own and other religious communities, because we are trying to figure this out all over again, learning relationships all over again, and making sure, and I want to point out today that if we focus clearly on our practice to really be in relationship, right relationship, we might have the opportunity not to just see culture written all over our faces, but we might have the opportunity to make sure that our ethics matches our modeling. So that's where I'm at. I know that's where I'm at. So I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Yeah, I really can think of nothing better to say than to repeat that piece that her husband, Edwin, wrote shortly after her death, and to think about how many of us would love to have this said about us. Service was her religion. She enjoyed life to the fullest. She didn't only do duty and was not forgetful of life's responsibilities. So we're going to close this with a song.